Paris, 1844. The city is alive with gaslight and ambition, its streets echoing with carriage wheels, political arguments, and the quiet confidence of a civilization that believes it is finally beginning to understand the human body. Medicine is advancing. Hospitals are becoming places of study, not just shelter. Doctors are writing case notes with the certainty that knowledge, once captured on paper, can tame even the most mysterious illnesses. And yet, hidden behind stone walls and iron gates, something is going terribly wrong. Inside one hospital ward, patients are forgetting who they are. Not metaphorically, not gradually, but completely. Men and women arrive with names, families, histories. Some come in delirious with fever, others after accidents, seizures, emotional collapse, or unexplained exhaustion. They are admitted, examined, recorded. And then, days later, they awaken to a terrifying blankness. They know how to speak, how to walk, how to follow instructions, but when asked the simplest question, the one that defines existence itself, they hesitate. What is your name? They cannot answer. Not because they are confused in the ordinary sense. Not because they are unconscious or incoherent. They are calm, alert, sometimes disturbingly so. They understand the question. They know that a name should exist. They feel its absence like a missing limb, an invisible wound. But the knowledge is gone. Along with it, memories of childhood, family, profession, even personal habits dissolve into silence. In 19th century Paris, this is not merely a medical curiosity. It is an existential horror. At a time when identity is increasingly documented, through papers, ledgers, birth records, and hospital files, losing one's name means losing legal, social, and moral existence. A nameless patient is not fully a person. They become a case, a subject, a problem to be studied. And in this particular ward, the problem does not resolve. Doctors begin to notice patterns. Too many patients. Too many similar symptoms. Too many empty stares when questions turn personal. Whispers move through the hospital corridors. Nurses exchange uneasy looks. Families arrive hoping for recovery and leave unsettled, their loved ones physically present but psychologically unreachable. Some patients recognize faces but not relationships. Others feel nothing at all, no panic, no grief, just a hollow neutrality that unsettles everyone around them. Something is stripping away identity itself. The ward gains an unspoken reputation. It is not marked on public maps. It is not discussed in newspapers. Officially, it exists to observe complex neurological and psychological cases. Unofficially, it becomes known among staff as a place where people go in whole and come out erased, or do not come out at all. This is an era obsessed with classification. Doctors believe that if they can name a condition, they can control it. Memory, however, refuses to cooperate. Is it stored in the brain like an organ? Is it spread through the nerves? Is it a moral faculty, shaped by character and discipline? Or is it something more fragile, something that can be fractured by shock, fear, or authority itself? No one truly knows. What makes this ward different is not simply that patients forget. Memory loss has been described before. Soldiers lose recollections after trauma. Fever patients wander in delirium. Grief can cloud the mind. But here, the forgetting is selective and profound. Language remains. Skills remain. Obedience remains. What disappears is personal narrative, the thread that turns a living body into a self. To the physicians of 1844, this is both terrifying and intoxicating. For the first time, they believe they may be witnessing memory in isolation, stripped from the rest of the mind. A chance to observe identity as a function, not a soul. A laboratory made of flesh and breath. And so the ward is watched closely. Patients are questioned repeatedly. Their reactions are noted. Their silences are measured. The absence of names becomes data. But for the patients, the experience is something else entirely. Imagine waking in a strange bed, surrounded by unfamiliar walls, aware that something fundamental has been taken from you. You know how to speak, but not what stories belong to your voice. You know that you once loved someone, but not who. You sense that your life stretched backward into years and places, but when you try to reach for them, your mind closes like a locked door. The past exists only as a rumor. Some patients panic at first. Others grow eerily calm. A few accept the blankness with a resignation that frightens the staff. Without memory, fear dulls. Without identity, resistance weakens. Patients follow routines because they have nothing else to anchor them. Days blur together. Questions repeat. Answers do not change. And slowly, the ward itself begins to shape them. In the absence of names, patients are called by numbers, diagnoses, or physical traits. Reducing language reduces personhood. Over time, even the idea of having once been someone begins to feel abstract. The ward becomes a world unto itself, governed by schedules and observation, where the past is irrelevant and the future undefined. Outside, Paris continues to celebrate progress. Inside, something deeply human is being unmade. What makes this story so disturbing is not only what happened, but how quietly it happened. There are no riots, no public scandals, no dramatic exposés. The ward operates within the accepted authority of medicine, shielded by the belief that doctors, by definition, are acting in the name of healing. Patients who cannot remember their names cannot object. Families who protest are told to trust the science. And science, in 1844, is still learning how dangerous ignorance can be when paired with confidence. Today, we understand far more about the brain. We have names for conditions that once seemed supernatural: dissociative amnesia, trauma-induced memory loss, functional neurological disorders. We recognize how isolation, fear, and institutional power can fracture identity. But this knowledge was paid for with real human lives, many of them forgotten. The ward in Paris did not just erase names. It revealed something deeply unsettling about medicine itself, that the line between treatment and control can vanish just as easily as memory. That when identity becomes an object of study, people can disappear without ever leaving the room. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: did the ward cause the forgetting? Or did it simply provide the perfect environment for it to spread? Because once a system exists where names no longer matter, forgetting becomes easy. And history, like memory, has a way of choosing what it allows to survive. To understand how a hospital ward in Paris could become a place where identity itself unraveled, it is necessary to understand the world that created it. Paris in 1844 was not simply a city, it was a laboratory of ideas. The French Revolution had torn apart the old order only decades earlier, replacing divine authority with reason, classification, and systems. Everything, from governments to human bodies, was expected to be understood, measured, and reorganized. Medicine stood at the center of this ambition. Hospitals were no longer merely charitable refuges for the poor and dying. They were becoming engines of knowledge. Patients were living texts, their bodies open books to be read by physicians trained to observe, record, and categorize. Paris led this transformation. Its hospitals attracted doctors from across Europe, all eager to study disease directly rather than relying on ancient texts or religious explanations. This new clinical medicine promised clarity, but it also created a dangerous imbalance of power. The patient existed to be examined. The doctor existed to interpret. Consent, dignity, and psychological safety were concepts still far in the future. Overcrowding was severe. Waves of rural migrants, political refugees, and the urban poor flooded into the city. Disease followed. Cholera, tuberculosis, typhus, and chronic nervous disorders filled the wards. Many patients arrived already disoriented from fever, hunger, exhaustion, or trauma. Hospitals became places of constant sensory overload, cries of pain, the smell of illness, the echo of footsteps in stone corridors. Recovery was uncertain. Survival itself often felt like chance. Within this environment, the mind was a mystery that fascinated and unsettled physicians. The brain could be dissected after death, but its living functions remained elusive. Memory, in particular, resisted understanding. Some believed it resided in specific brain structures. Others thought it was distributed through the nervous system. Many still clung to moral explanations, arguing that weak character, emotional excess, or sinful living could damage the mind. Scientific certainty was mixed with cultural judgment. Mental illness occupied an especially uncomfortable position. It was neither fully physical nor safely spiritual. Patients who suffered from confusion, delusions, or emotional collapse were often treated with a combination of observation, restraint, and routine. Parisian asylums and hospital wards developed strict regimens designed to impose order on chaotic minds. Silence, repetition, and surveillance were considered therapeutic. If a mind was broken, it was believed it could be reshaped through discipline. At the same time, Paris was obsessed with the idea of identity. Papers, names, and records mattered more than ever. The state tracked citizens through documents. Police catalogued bodies and behaviors. Scientists measured skulls, categorized faces, and searched for physical markers of personality and criminality. A person was increasingly defined not by community memory, but by written proof. To lose one's name in such a society was to fall into a bureaucratic void. This cultural fixation influenced medicine deeply. Patients were reduced to case numbers, symptoms, and outcomes. Their personal histories mattered only insofar as they informed diagnosis. In teaching hospitals, students gathered around bedsides to observe unusual cases. The patient's experience was secondary to the lesson. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Suffering became instructional. It was also an era of experimentation, often unacknowledged, rarely regulated. New treatments were tried with confidence but little evidence. Bleeding, purging, isolation, and electrical stimulation were applied in the name of progress. When results were unclear, treatments were adjusted, intensified, or repeated. Failure was rarely seen as harm, it was seen as data. Psychological distress was especially vulnerable to this mindset. Without clear physical lesions to explain symptoms, doctors felt free to explore theories of suggestion, willpower, and nervous influence. The boundary between treatment and experiment blurred. Patients who were already confused or frightened became ideal subjects. Their inability to articulate consent was interpreted as a lack of resistance rather than a warning sign. The hospital ward that would later gain its unsettling reputation did not emerge in isolation. It was a product of these beliefs. A specialized space designed to observe difficult cases made sense within the logic of the time. Isolating patients with unusual mental symptoms was seen as both practical and humane. Away from the chaos of general wards, doctors believed they could focus, monitor progress, and protect others from disturbing behavior. But isolation has consequences. Removed from familiar environments, stripped of social roles, and placed under constant observation, patients entered a psychological vacuum. Their days were structured by bells, meals, examinations, and sleep. Conversation was limited. Personal belongings were often removed. Family visits were restricted. The ward became the center of existence, replacing the outside world entirely. In such conditions, memory becomes fragile. Modern research shows that memory is reinforced through social interaction, environmental cues, and emotional connection. Remove those, and recollection begins to erode. In 1844, this was not understood. Doctors interpreted fading memory as a symptom of illness rather than a reaction to environment. When patients struggled to recall their names or histories, it confirmed medical theories instead of challenging them. Fear also played a role. Hospitals were places where people went to die. The authority of doctors was absolute. Questioning treatment was rare and dangerous. Patients who resisted could be labeled uncooperative or unstable. Compliance was rewarded with gentler treatment. Over time, many patients learned that obedience was safer than self-assertion. For those already weakened by illness or trauma, the psychological pressure was immense. The constant questioning, "Who are you? Where are you from? What do you remember?" could become overwhelming. Each failure reinforced the sense of absence. Each blank answer became proof of deficiency. Memory did not simply fade, it was repeatedly tested and found wanting. Parisian society, meanwhile, looked away. Hospitals were necessary evils, places where suffering was managed out of sight. As long as progress continued, few asked what it cost. Medical journals focused on successes. Failures were buried in footnotes or forgotten entirely. A ward where patients forgot their names did not threaten public order. It threatened only individuals whose voices no longer carried weight. This is the world in which the ward existed, a city convinced of its own rationality, a medical system confident in its authority, and a society willing to sacrifice the individual in pursuit of knowledge. The tragedy was not born from cruelty alone, but from certainty. From the belief that understanding the human mind justified any method, and that identity was something that could be taken apart and studied without consequence. By the time doubts began to surface, the damage was already done. Patients had passed through the ward and emerged changed, if they emerged at all. Their names, once spoken in families and neighborhoods, faded from memory, first their own, and then everyone else's. The hospital itself was an institution shaped as much by stone and iron as by ideology. From the outside, it appeared no different from the other medical buildings scattered across Paris. High walls, narrow windows, an air of authority meant to reassure the public that order reigned within. But once inside, the atmosphere changed. Long corridors swallowed sound. Footsteps echoed and disappeared. The smell of antiseptics mixed with damp stone and human presence. This was not a place designed for comfort. It was designed for observation. Somewhere deep within this complex, away from the general wards filled with coughing bodies and moans of pain, existed a smaller, quieter space. Officially, it was not extraordinary. On paper, it was simply a ward reserved for patients with complex nervous conditions. In practice, it was different. Fewer beds. Fewer visitors. More locks. More rules. Staff spoke in lower voices here, as if noise itself might disturb whatever fragile balance existed inside. This ward was deliberately separated from the rest of the hospital. Not entirely hidden, but inconveniently placed. To reach it, one passed through multiple corridors, a set of doors that required authorization, and a final threshold where the air felt heavier. The architecture itself created distance, not just physical, but psychological. Patients brought here were already marked as different. They were no longer simply sick. They were uncertain. Inside, the ward followed a strict order. Beds were evenly spaced. Personal items were minimal. There were no family photographs, no letters pinned to walls, no reminders of lives beyond the hospital. Curtains, when present, were thin and usually left open. Observation was constant. Nurses recorded sleep patterns, appetite, responses to questions. Doctors visited in groups, sometimes accompanied by students who stood at the foot of beds and watched in silence. Names mattered less here than symptoms. Patients were identified by case numbers or descriptive labels. Male, approximately 35, memory disturbance. Female, mid-20s, confusion without delirium. These descriptions appeared in ledgers, repeated in reports, and slowly replaced the names patients had once carried. For those who could still remember who they were, the shift was unsettling. For those who could not, it became reality. The ward's routines were unchanging. Wake at the same hour. Meals at fixed times. Walks along the corridor under supervision. Questions asked again and again. Do you know where you are? Do you know today's date? Do you know your name? Each question was delivered calmly, almost gently, but the repetition had weight. For patients struggling to remember, each failure reinforced a sense of inadequacy. For those who had already forgotten, the questions became meaningless exercises. Over time, the ward developed its own internal logic. Patients who complied were left undisturbed. Those who showed distress were isolated further. Silence was encouraged. Emotional expression was noted, sometimes discouraged, sometimes recorded as evidence of instability. The goal was control, of behavior, of environment, of outcomes. Staff members were not villains in the traditional sense. Many believed sincerely in what they were doing. They had been trained to see themselves as guardians of reason in a world of chaos. Emotional detachment was considered professional. To empathize too deeply was to risk clouding judgment. And yet, even among them, discomfort grew. Nurses noticed how patients changed after extended stays. Individuals who had arrived frightened and confused became placid, even passive. They stopped asking questions. They stopped expressing frustration. Some smiled vaguely when addressed. Others stared past whoever spoke to them, their attention fixed on nothing in particular. It was not improvement in any meaningful sense. It was erosion. Families who were allowed to visit struggled to understand what they were seeing. A husband might recognize his wife's face but find no recognition in her eyes. A mother might hear her son speak fluently yet realize he no longer knew who she was. Doctors explained this as part of the condition. Memory, they said, was delicate. Recovery would take time. Trust the process. But the process offered no guarantees. The physical space of the ward contributed to this slow unraveling. Light was limited. Windows were high, designed more for ventilation than view. The outside world was reduced to patches of sky and shifting daylight. Sounds from the city, vendors, bells, street arguments, rarely reached inside. Days blended together. Without external markers of time, memory had nothing to attach itself to. Even language changed within the ward. Conversations were functional. Instructions replaced dialogue. Personal stories were unnecessary, even discouraged. Patients who attempted to speak about vague memories were redirected toward present tasks. The past was treated as unreliable, potentially harmful. Better to focus on the now, on routine, on compliance. For patients whose identities were already fragile, this environment accelerated the loss. Memory is not a static archive. It is a living process, reinforced through repetition and connection. In the ward, connections were severed. Repetition existed, but only of emptiness. Each day confirmed that the past was inaccessible and perhaps irrelevant. Some patients arrived with partial amnesia, able to recall fragments but not complete narratives. In other environments, those fragments might have served as anchors for recovery. Here, they were treated as inconsistencies. Doctors sought clear patterns, not messy recollections. When memories did not fit expectations, they were dismissed. There were also those who arrived fully aware of who they were, only to deteriorate after weeks inside. Stress, fear, and isolation took their toll. The constant pressure to perform memory, under observation, under judgment, turned recollection into a source of anxiety. The harder they tried to remember, the more elusive memory became. Eventually, some stopped trying at all. The ward did not simply house forgetfulness. It cultivated it. From an administrative perspective, the ward functioned efficiently. Cases were documented. Patterns were analyzed. Reports were written. From a human perspective, it was something else entirely, a place where people were slowly reduced to clinical phenomena. Once a patient forgot their name, reclaiming it became increasingly difficult. Without external reminders, without reinforcement, identity dissolved into abstraction. And then there was the question of exit. Patients who showed physical improvement but remained amnesiac posed a problem. They were no longer acutely ill, yet they could not be safely returned to society. Without names or histories, they had no legal standing. Discharge required documentation. Documentation required identity. And so some patients remained longer than intended, trapped by the very condition the ward was meant to study. Others were transferred to different institutions, their case files following them while their personal identities did not. In ledgers, they existed as numbers moving from one column to another. In reality, they were people slipping further into anonymity. The ward's existence was rarely discussed outside professional circles. It was not considered a failure. On the contrary, it was seen as a necessary frontier. Understanding the mind required sacrifice. And those who passed through the ward became part of that cost. What no one could fully admit, not then, was that the ward itself had become an active force. It did not merely observe memory loss. It shaped it. The walls, the routines, the language, the authority, all worked together to create an environment where forgetting was not only possible, but likely. In isolating patients from their pasts, the ward ensured that the past would not return easily. And once a name is lost in such a place, it does not simply wait to be remembered. It fades, quietly, until even the question no longer makes sense. The first cases did not arrive with alarm bells attached to them. At least, not at first. They were admitted like so many others in Parisian hospitals of the time, men and women brought in by family members, police officers, or parish officials who could no longer manage them at home. Some were feverish, their bodies shaking with infection. Others had collapsed in the street after seizures or accidents. A few arrived quietly, withdrawn, unable to explain what was wrong but clearly not well. Their names were taken, their ages approximated, their conditions noted. Everything appeared routine. The strangeness revealed itself later. A man admitted after a severe febrile illness regained physical strength within days. His temperature stabilized. His speech was clear. He followed instructions without difficulty. When a physician asked him where he lived, he hesitated. When asked his occupation, he shook his head. And when the question finally came, his name, he stared at the doctor with an expression that unsettled everyone in the room. He understood the question. That much was obvious. But the answer did not exist. Another patient, a young woman brought in after what her family described as nervous collapse, initially spoke of vague distress and exhaustion. She slept for nearly 2 days. When she awoke, she recognized the ward, understood she was in a hospital, and spoke fluently about the present moment. But she did not know who she was. She could not recall her parents' faces, even when they stood beside her bed. She described a sensation of emptiness where memories should have been, as if entire years had been removed in a single motion. Doctors recorded these incidents carefully. They were unusual, but not unprecedented. Memory disturbances were known to accompany illness. What unsettled the staff was how complete the forgetting was, and how calm many patients seemed about it. Panic was expected. Desperation, grief, confusion. Instead, there was often a quiet acceptance. Patients acknowledged the absence of memory without visible distress, as though identity were optional. As more cases appeared, patterns began to emerge. Patients did not forget language. They did not lose basic skills. They could dress themselves, eat properly, and navigate the ward. Some could perform complex tasks without hesitation. What vanished was autobiographical memory, the narrative thread of self. Childhood, family, profession, personal preferences all disappeared together. There were no gradual declines. The loss was abrupt, clean, almost surgical. One man could recite prayers learned in youth but could not recall who taught him. Another woman could sew with remarkable skill yet had no memory of ever learning to sew. These fragments puzzled physicians. How could the mind retain function while losing origin? Where did experience reside if not in memory? Families were often the first to realize the severity of what had occurred. They arrived expecting recovery and were instead confronted with strangers wearing familiar faces. A husband might introduce himself only to receive a polite nod. A mother might speak her child's name repeatedly, watching for recognition that never came. Some patients reacted with discomfort when confronted by loved ones, sensing emotional expectation they could not fulfill. Others smiled awkwardly, attempting to please, mimicking responses without understanding them. Doctors reassured families that memory might return. They spoke of rest, observation, and time. But privately, their notes grew longer and more detailed. The cases were no longer isolated. There were too many similarities, too many patients forgetting too much, too quickly. Some patients arrived already disoriented, but others lost their memories after admission. This distinction was critical. In several cases, individuals could clearly recall their identities during initial examinations, only to lose them days later. The transition was not always dramatic. There was no scream, no collapse. One day, a patient answered questions. The next, they could not. These moments disturbed even seasoned physicians. Illness could explain confusion, but what explained this sudden absence? The body appeared stable. The mind, however, had emptied itself. Patient records from this period often include phrases that betray uncertainty. Memory abolished. Personal history inaccessible. Identity absent, intelligence preserved. Such language reveals a struggle to describe something that did not fit existing categories. Doctors were accustomed to partial impairment. Total erasure challenged their assumptions. The patients themselves described their condition in ways that were deeply unsettling. Some spoke of feeling hollow, as though something essential had been removed without pain. Others reported a constant sensation of being on the edge of remembering, like standing before a locked door whose key had been lost. A few expressed vague unease, an awareness that they were missing something important, though they could not articulate what it was. Not all patients were passive. Some became distressed when pressed for answers. Repeated questioning seemed to worsen anxiety. When doctors insisted that a name must exist, patients sometimes grew agitated, frustrated by their inability to comply. In response, staff often increased supervision, interpreting distress as further evidence of pathology. In time, patients began to resemble one another. The differences that once defined them, social class, occupation, temperament, flattened under the ward's routines. Without personal narratives, individuality blurred. Doctors noted how patients spoke in similar tones, used similar phrases, and displayed similar emotional restraint. It was as if the absence of memory was creating a new, shared identity defined by the ward itself. The term forgetting no longer seemed sufficient. This was not mere loss. It was replacement. What disturbed some observers most was how rarely memories returned. There were occasional improvements. A patient might recall a first name, a place, a fleeting image. These moments were celebrated, recorded as breakthroughs. But they were fragile. Without reinforcement, the memories often faded again. The environment offered little to anchor them. In a few cases, patients were discharged despite persistent amnesia. They left the hospital without names, guided by officials or distant relatives who hoped familiarity might restore what medicine could not. Some vanished from records entirely. Others returned months later, unchanged or worse, their inability to reintegrate marking them as failures of both family and institution. Within the ward, the accumulation of such cases created an atmosphere of quiet dread. Staff did not speak openly about it, but everyone sensed that something unusual was unfolding. This was not an epidemic of infection. It spread without contact. It respected no age or gender. It affected those who arrived sick and those who arrived relatively healthy. The more the ward observed, the more it seemed to produce what it studied. Doctors began to wonder whether the patients shared some hidden vulnerability. A nervous disposition, emotional sensitivity, weakness of will. These explanations were comforting because they absolved the institution itself of responsibility. If the cause lay within the patient, the ward was merely a witness. But doubts lingered. The cases raised questions medicine was not prepared to answer. If identity could vanish while intellect remained, what did that say about the self? If memory could be erased without visible injury, how stable was the mind? And if patients forgot who they were under observation, what role did observation itself play? The first patients were no longer anomalies. They were the foundation of a pattern that would define the ward's reputation. Each new admission reinforced the sense that this place did something to people, something that went beyond illness. And as more names were lost, recorded only in fading ink on hospital ledgers, the ward became not just a site of treatment, but a silent factory of forgetting. Faced with patients who could speak, reason, and move yet could not remember who they were, the physicians of 1844 turned to the only tools they possessed: theory, classification, and authority. They believed that if they could name the mechanism behind the forgetting, they could contain it. But memory, unlike a broken bone or infected lung, refused to reveal itself under the familiar rules of anatomy. What followed was a period of intense speculation, debate, and increasingly confident explanation built on very fragile foundations. At the time, the brain was understood primarily through dissection. Doctors searched for lesions, swellings, or discolorations that might explain mental disturbance. When no clear damage appeared in patients who later died, some concluded that memory loss must be functional rather than structural. This term carried a dangerous implication. If the brain was intact, then the problem lay in how it was being used. Memory, they argued, was not destroyed but inhibited, suppressed, or suspended. One popular explanation was nervous exhaustion. The modern city, physicians believed, strained the nerves beyond their natural limits. Overwork, emotional shock, sexual excess, grief, and fear were thought to drain nervous energy, leaving the mind incapable of sustaining memory. Patients who forgot their names were seen as victims of this invisible depletion. Rest, routine, and isolation were prescribed as cures. The ward's strict environment seemed perfectly suited to this theory. Others attributed the condition to moral shock. A sudden emotional trauma, witnessing death, experiencing disgrace, losing social standing, was believed to fracture the mind's continuity. In this view, memory loss was not random but defensive. The mind erased what it could not bear. Doctors searched patient histories for shame, loss, or scandal, sometimes inventing explanations when evidence was lacking. If a patient had forgotten their name, it was assumed they had something to forget. Hysteria also played a role, especially in female patients. The diagnosis was vague and expansive, capable of explaining almost any psychological disturbance. Forgetting was interpreted as a manifestation of emotional instability, a mind overwhelmed by feeling and therefore incapable of rational self-knowledge. Such explanations justified paternalistic treatment and reinforced existing gender biases within medicine. Some physicians proposed more mechanical theories. Memory, they argued, might reside in specific regions of the brain that could be temporarily impaired without visible damage. Fever, inflammation, or circulatory disruption might interfere with these regions, selectively erasing personal recollection while sparing general intelligence. These ideas hinted at modern neuroscience but lacked empirical support. Without tools to observe the living brain, speculation filled the gaps. There were also those who believed memory was not purely biological at all. Influenced by philosophy and theology, they argued that memory was tied to the soul or moral self. In this framework, forgetting one's name represented a spiritual dislocation. Patients had lost not just recollection, but their connection to personal essence. Treatment, therefore, required moral guidance as much as medical intervention. These competing theories shared one assumption, that the forgetting originated entirely within the patient. Rarely did doctors consider that the hospital environment itself might contribute to the condition. To do so would have challenged the authority of the institution and the legitimacy of its methods. Physicians documented the cases with meticulous detail. They noted what patients could remember and what they could not. They tested recall repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times a day. Names, dates, places, family members, all were probed, recorded, and analyzed. When patients failed, it was taken as confirmation of diagnosis rather than a sign of distress. Repetition was believed to stimulate recovery, even when it seemed to deepen confusion. In some cases, doctors attempted to provoke memory through confrontation. Patients were shown mirrors, family members, or personal objects. If recognition did not occur, the absence was interpreted as further evidence of pathology. Emotional reactions were scrutinized. Indifference was seen as abnormal. Distress was seen as instability. There was no acceptable response. The confidence with which physicians interpreted these behaviors masked deep uncertainty. Medical journals of the period reveal ongoing debates about whether memory could truly be separated from intellect. Some argued that identity was inseparable from consciousness, and that its loss represented a fundamental breakdown of the mind. Others insisted that identity was an accumulation of habits and associations that could be stripped away without destroying reason. This debate had practical consequences. If identity was seen as expendable, treatment could focus on restoring function rather than personhood. Patients who could eat, speak, and obey were considered improved, even if they remained nameless. In this way, forgetting became normalized. The absence of self was no longer an emergency, but a condition to be managed. Doctors also speculated about the role of suggestion. Though not yet formalized as hypnosis, the idea that the mind could be influenced by authority and expectation was gaining traction. Some believed that repeated questioning might actually reinforce forgetting by drawing attention to absence. Others dismissed this as superstition, insisting that the doctor's role was neutral and objective. Few considered the psychological impact of being constantly told that one's memory was defective. Patients internalized the language used to describe them. When repeatedly informed that they were incapable of remembering, some ceased attempting to do so. This withdrawal was interpreted as further decline rather than self-protection. As theories multiplied, so did treatments. Isolation was extended. Silence was enforced. Patients were encouraged to abandon attempts to recall the past and focus on routine. In some cases, this was justified as reducing distress. In others, it was framed as discipline. Memory, doctors believed, would return once the mind was calm and orderly. Yet the calm they observed was often unnatural. Patients became emotionally flat, detached, and compliant. This was recorded as improvement. The loss of distress was equated with healing, even when identity did not return. The possibility that the treatment itself was suppressing memory was rarely acknowledged. There were dissenting voices. A few physicians questioned whether the ward's methods might be causing harm. They noted that patients admitted for physical ailments sometimes developed memory loss only after prolonged stays. They observed that those removed from the ward occasionally showed slight improvement. But these observations remained marginal, overshadowed by dominant theories that placed responsibility on the patient's mind. The medical establishment favored explanations that preserved its authority. To suggest that the hospital environment could erase identity would have been to admit a failure of care. It was easier to believe that memory loss was an inevitable consequence of disease, character, or fate. In this climate, theory became a shield. It protected doctors from doubt and patients from being seen as victims of the system. The ward continued to operate under the assumption that forgetting was a symptom to be studied, not a warning sign. And as long as explanations existed, no matter how speculative, the practice continued. What these theories could not explain was why forgetting seemed to cluster in one place, under one set of conditions. They could not explain why memory loss deepened over time rather than resolving. And they could not explain why identity, once gone, so rarely returned. Medicine believed it was observing the mind. In reality, it was reshaping it, guided by theories that mistook control for understanding. By the early 1840s, Paris was gripped by a peculiar fascination with the invisible forces of the mind. Science had begun to distance itself from superstition, yet it had not fully escaped it. Between anatomy and mysticism lay a grey zone where speculation flourished, and it was here that ideas of mesmerism, magnetic influence, and mental suggestion found fertile ground. For physicians confronted with patients who had lost their identities without visible injury, these ideas offered both explanation and opportunity. Mesmerism, derived from the theories of Franz Anton Mesmer, proposed that an invisible magnetic fluid flowed through the human body. When disrupted, it could cause illness. When guided by a skilled practitioner, it could heal. Though officially controversial, mesmerism was taken seriously by many in Parisian medical circles. Public demonstrations drew crowds. Subjects fell into trance-like states, lost awareness of their surroundings, or displayed altered personalities. Memory, in these performances, appeared malleable. Doctors watching such demonstrations could not ignore the implications. If suggestion could alter perception, emotion, or awareness, could it also suppress memory? Could identity itself be influenced by external authority? These questions blurred the line between therapy and experiment. Within hospitals, formal mesmerist sessions were rare, but the principles seeped into medical practice. Physicians became increasingly attentive to the power of voice, expectation, and repetition. They noticed that patients responded to authority, that tone mattered, that certain phrases produced calm while others produced distress. The mind, it seemed, could be guided. In the ward where patients forgot their names, this belief took on disturbing significance. Repeated questioning, constant observation, and authoritative declarations about a patient's condition were not seen as psychologically intrusive. They were seen as necessary stimuli. If memory was blocked, it could be unlocked through insistence, or so doctors believed. Some physicians experimented quietly. They altered the way questions were asked. They introduced new routines. They attempted to provoke recollection through firm instruction or gentle reassurance. In a few cases, patients appeared to enter states of deep focus or detachment, responding automatically without apparent reflection. These states were documented with interest. They resembled the trances described in mesmerist literature. There were even instances where doctors attempted to induce such states deliberately. Patients were instructed to relax, fix their attention, and listen carefully. Calm voices guided them through exercises meant to restore order to the mind. When memories failed to return, doctors interpreted the response as resistance or deeper blockage, not as evidence that the method itself might be harmful. The idea that memory could be rewritten gained traction. If experiences could be forgotten under shock or suggestion, perhaps new associations could replace them. Routine, repetition, and institutional structure were seen as tools for rebuilding the self. The ward's strict schedules and controlled environment were reframed as therapeutic instruments designed to overwrite disorder with discipline. This approach carried a dangerous assumption that identity was flexible enough to be reshaped without consequence. Patients who showed compliance were praised. Those who questioned their condition or expressed distress were seen as obstructive. Emotional flattening was interpreted as stability. In some cases, doctors noted that patients seemed more manageable after extended stays. This manageability was quietly valued. It made the ward function smoothly. It also aligned with the belief that the mind, once calmed, would eventually recover its memories. Yet recovery rarely came. Instead, patients often sank deeper into passivity. They responded to commands but initiated little. They spoke less about themselves and more about immediate tasks. Their sense of personal continuity faded. To physicians influenced by suggestion theory, this was not failure. It was evidence that the mind had entered a controlled state, free from disruptive recollection. Public interest in hypnotic phenomena further reinforced these ideas. Though hypnosis would not be formally named until later decades, its principles were already circulating. Subjects under suggestion could forget pain, lose awareness of time, or adopt new behaviors. Such demonstrations convinced many that memory was not fixed. It could be suppressed or altered through mental influence alone. This belief normalized the erasure of identity within medical settings. If forgetting could be induced temporarily in a public demonstration, why not in a hospital? If memory could be suspended for therapeutic reasons, why worry when it failed to return? The ethical implications were rarely discussed. Consent was assumed, not obtained. Patients did not volunteer to have their identities altered. They were subjected to authority they could not challenge. The power imbalance was absolute. Doctors spoke. Patients listened. Suggestion flowed in one direction. Some physicians became increasingly convinced that the ward itself functioned as a kind of extended suggestion. The constant message, spoken and unspoken, was that patients were broken, incomplete, in need of correction. Over time, patients appeared to accept this narrative. They stopped asserting themselves. They deferred to staff for definitions of reality. In modern terms, this resembles psychological conditioning. But in 1844, it was considered progress. There were critics, even then. A small number of medical thinkers warned that excessive focus on mental influence risked damaging the very faculties it sought to heal. They argued that suggestion could suppress symptoms without resolving underlying issues. But such voices were drowned out by enthusiasm for control and order. The ward became a testing ground for ideas that could not be openly acknowledged as experiments. There were no protocols, no oversight, no systematic evaluation of harm. Results were interpreted subjectively. If a patient became calmer, it was success. If they forgot more, it was progression of illness. There was no outcome that challenged the theory. In this environment, forgetting one's name became almost expected. New patients were watched closely for signs of identity loss. When it occurred, it confirmed beliefs rather than raising alarms. The phenomenon fed on itself, reinforced by interpretation and practice. The most unsettling possibility, that suggestion, authority, and environment were actively producing the condition, remained largely unspoken. To admit it would have required a fundamental rethinking of medical power. It would have meant acknowledging that doctors could harm minds without touching bodies. Instead, mesmerism and early hypnotic ideas offered a comforting narrative. The mind was mysterious, influence was subtle, and outcomes were unpredictable. If patients forgot who they were, it was because memory was fragile, not because the ward demanded its surrender. In this way, theories meant to explain identity loss became tools that enabled it. The belief that memory could be manipulated made manipulation acceptable. And within the controlled silence of the ward, suggestion did not need a swinging watch or whispered command. It was embedded in routine, reinforced by authority, and sustained by the absence of alternatives. What began as fascination with the mind's flexibility ended as quiet erasure. Patients did not simply forget. They were guided, subtly and persistently, toward forgetting, and no one was certain how to bring them back. Life inside the ward followed a rhythm so precise that it seemed designed to replace thought itself. Bells marked the hours. Meals arrived at the same time each day, identical in portion and presentation. Beds were made and remade with ritual consistency. Patients were guided through the same motions, along the same corridors, past the same walls, until movement required no memory at all. The routine was not merely practical, it was foundational. In the absence of personal history, repetition became identity. Patients woke not to names but to instruction. A nurse's voice, calm and firm, directed them to rise, wash, and prepare for examination. Conversation was minimal. Questions unrelated to treatment were discouraged. When patients attempted to speak about vague impressions, faces they almost recognized, places they felt they had known, they were gently redirected. The present moment was emphasized. The past was treated as unreliable, even dangerous. Breakfast was eaten in near silence. Utensils scraped against plates. Eyes drifted, unfocused. Some patients ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. Others hesitated, unsure of etiquette, then copied the behavior of those beside them. Without memory, social cues had to be relearned through observation. The ward itself became the teacher. Examinations followed predictable patterns. Doctors arrived in groups, their footsteps announcing authority. Patients were asked the same questions every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Where are you? Do you know today's date? Do you know your name? The questions were delivered without malice, but their constancy wore down resistance. For patients who could not answer, each repetition reinforced failure. For those who might have remembered fragments, the pressure to perform often erased what little remained. Between examinations, patients walked the corridors under supervision. The paths never changed. Windows offered little distraction. There were no clocks within sight, no calendars. Time lost its meaning. Days blurred together, indistinguishable from one another. Without temporal markers, memory had nothing to attach itself to. The ward existed in a perpetual present. Personal belongings were scarce. Clothing was standardized. Patients wore similar garments, washed and replaced by staff. The absence of personal items removed reminders of life outside the ward. There were no letters to reread, no objects to trigger recollection. The environment was intentionally neutral, stripped of individuality. What remained was function. Conversation among patients was limited and often discouraged. Staff worried that unregulated interaction might reinforce confusion or spread distress. When patients did speak to one another, their exchanges were tentative, shallow. Without shared pasts or personal context, dialogue rarely moved beyond the immediate. Names were not exchanged, partly because many patients did not have them. Relationships formed slowly, based on proximity rather than recognition. Some patients began to mirror one another. Speech patterns converged. Gestures synchronized. Emotional expression flattened. It was as though the ward itself was imprinting a shared personality onto its inhabitants. This was noted with interest by physicians, who interpreted it as stabilization. The chaos of individual difference was giving way to order. Afternoons were quieter. Patients sat, stood, or lay down under observation. Idleness was framed as rest, though it often resembled waiting without expectation. Minds unoccupied by memory drifted. Some patients stared for hours at the same patch of wall. Others paced the same few steps repeatedly. These behaviors were recorded but rarely questioned. They were considered manifestations of the condition, not responses to confinement. Evenings brought another round of routines. Meals. Hygiene. Bed. The day ended as it began, without reflection. For patients who still possessed fragments of identity, night could be the hardest. In darkness, without distraction, unease surfaced. A sense of absence pressed in. Some patients cried quietly, unsure why. Others slept heavily, exhaustion replacing thought. Staff members adapted to this environment as well. Emotional distance became necessary. To engage too deeply with patients who had lost themselves was painful and confusing. Nurses learned to focus on tasks. Doctors learned to focus on data. The ward demanded detachment from everyone within it. Patients who showed signs of agitation were isolated further. Solitary rooms were used to calm disturbances. Silence was enforced as treatment. In isolation, patients had even fewer anchors to reality. Some emerged quieter, more compliant. This was recorded as success. Others emerged more detached, less responsive. This too was recorded, but without alarm. Over time, patients stopped asking questions about themselves. The effort seemed futile. When told they were ill, they accepted it. When told they did not remember, they nodded. The idea that something had been taken from them faded. In its place grew a passive acceptance of the ward's reality. This acceptance was perhaps the most disturbing outcome of all. For those who arrived with partial memory, the ward accelerated forgetting. Without reinforcement, names faded. Faces lost meaning. Emotional connections weakened. Patients who initially protested their loss eventually fell silent. Silence was safer. Silence was expected. Doctors noted this progression with satisfaction. The ward was calm, orderly, predictable. Patients were manageable. The absence of conflict was interpreted as healing. Few asked what had been sacrificed to achieve it. The ward did not need force to erase identity. It used structure. It used repetition. It used authority. Slowly, relentlessly, it taught patients that the past did not matter and that the present required nothing of them beyond obedience. In such an environment, forgetting was not an accident. It was the natural outcome. By the time patients had spent weeks or months inside, their former lives felt abstract, almost fictional. Even if memories resurfaced briefly, they felt unreal, disconnected from the sterile present. Without confirmation, without validation, those memories withered. The ward offered no mirrors in which a former self could be recognized. And so life continued, day after identical day, inside a place where identity had no use. The routines functioned flawlessly. The system sustained itself. But the people within it slowly disappeared, not physically, but as selves. They remained alive, breathing, responsive. Yet the question that once defined them no longer mattered. Who are you? Inside the ward, it was no longer a question anyone expected to answer. Inside the ward, time did not move forward so much as it circled endlessly. The days were not remembered, they were endured. Patients learned quickly that nothing new would happen, and in that knowledge, expectation died. Morning followed night without significance. The future offered no promise, and the past offered no refuge. What remained was a narrow strip of existence defined entirely by the ward's rules. The absence of choice was subtle but complete. Patients were told when to wake, when to eat, when to walk, when to sit, when to sleep. Even bodily needs were anticipated and managed. This removal of decision-making was presented as care. Responsibility, doctors believed, burdened unstable minds. Relief came through surrender. And so patients surrendered, one small autonomy at a time. Those who arrived with stronger personalities resisted at first. They questioned routines. They demanded explanations. They asked to see family members more often. These behaviors were documented as agitation or lack of insight. Resistance became a symptom. Treatment intensified. Over time, resistance softened, then vanished. Not because patients agreed, but because persistence required a self they were losing. Language within the ward reinforced this erosion. Patients were rarely addressed directly. Instructions were delivered impersonally. Praise, when given, was vague. Good, calm, improving. These words did not attach to identity, they attached to behavior. A patient learned that being good meant compliance, not recovery. This lesson settled deep. Meals provided one of the few moments of communal activity, yet even here individuality was suppressed. Everyone ate the same food, in the same way, at the same pace. Conversation was discouraged, sometimes forbidden. Silence was easier to manage. Silence did not disrupt. Over time, patients forgot what they might have talked about anyway. Without memories, conversation had nowhere to begin. Physical contact was minimal. Nurses assisted when necessary but avoided unnecessary touch. Doctors examined without warmth. The human body became an object of study, not connection. In this emotional vacuum, patients stopped seeking comfort. Seeking required knowing what comfort once felt like. Sleep offered no escape. Dreams, when they came, were often fragmented and confusing. Some patients reported images without context, faces without names, places without meaning. Others slept heavily, sinking into unconsciousness as if trying to disappear. Nightmares went unrecorded unless they caused disturbance. Inner experience mattered only when it disrupted order. Occasionally, a patient would experience a sudden emotional surge. Tears would appear without explanation. Panic would rise, seemingly from nowhere. Staff responded quickly, interpreting these moments as instability. Sedation, isolation, or increased supervision followed. The episode would pass, and the patient would return quieter than before. Emotional expression, the last refuge of identity, was systematically extinguished. The ward did not encourage storytelling. Patients were not asked to recount their lives beyond diagnostic questioning. There was no space for narrative, no interest in subjective meaning. Without storytelling, memory atrophied. The self, after all, is built from stories we tell ourselves. Deprived of that practice, the self weakened. Over time, patients began to refer to themselves in impersonal terms, if they referred to themselves at all. The patient replaced I. Some avoided pronouns entirely. Language adjusted to absence. This shift went largely unnoticed by staff, who were accustomed to clinical detachment. But it marked a profound internal change. When a person stopped saying I, something essential has already been lost. The ward's calm became its greatest achievement and its greatest danger. There were no outbursts, no chaos, no scenes that demanded attention. From an administrative standpoint, the ward was a success. From a human standpoint, it was a quiet annihilation. New patients entering the ward sensed something immediately. They noticed the stillness, the lack of urgency, the way others moved without purpose. This atmosphere exerted pressure. Those who still remembered themselves felt disoriented not only by illness, but by the absence of reflected identity around them. There were no models of recovery, only examples of resignation. Staff turnover was low. Those who remained learned to accept the ward's logic. They spoke of patients as stable, manageable, settled. Rarely did they use words like whole or restored. Such concepts felt unrealistic. Stability was enough. On rare occasions, a patient would attempt to reconstruct a self. They would choose a name arbitrarily, invent a past, or cling to a vague sensation of having been someone specific. These attempts were gently discouraged. False memories, doctors warned, could be harmful. Better to accept uncertainty than to build on illusion. And so even the act of self-creation was denied. Visitors, when allowed, often left shaken. They described the ward as orderly but unsettling. Their loved ones seemed distant, polite, altered. Conversations went nowhere. Emotional reciprocity was gone. Some families stopped visiting, unable to bear the experience. Their absence further reinforced the patient's isolation. For patients, the ward became the only reality that mattered. Without memory, without expectation, they adapted. Adaptation was praised. Survival became synonymous with disappearance. The self, once a source of pain and confusion, receded. In its place remained a functioning body, responding to cues, occupying space. This transformation was not instantaneous. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly. There was no single moment when identity vanished. Instead, it eroded through countless small omissions. A question not asked. A memory not reinforced. A choice not offered. Over weeks and months, these absences accumulated until there was nothing left to lose. In this way, the ward did not simply house patients who had forgotten their names. It trained them to live without needing one. And that, perhaps, was its most devastating accomplishment. As the ward continued to function with its quiet efficiency, an uncomfortable question lingered beneath the routines and records, rarely spoken aloud but impossible to fully suppress. Were these patients being treated, or were they being managed? In 1844, the language of ethics had not yet caught up with the power medicine wielded, and nowhere was that imbalance more apparent than in places where patients could not advocate for themselves. Consent, as a concept, barely existed in practice. Admission to a hospital implied surrender to authority. Once inside, patients were expected to comply with examination, treatment, and observation without protest. Those who questioned their care risked being labeled difficult or unstable. For patients who had forgotten their names, resistance was not just unlikely, it was nearly impossible. Without identity, there was no ground from which to object. Doctors justified their actions through the lens of necessity. These patients, they argued, were incapable of making rational decisions. Their memory loss rendered them unfit to understand their condition, let alone participate in treatment choices. Responsibility therefore fell to the physician, whose duty was to act in the patient's best interest as defined by medical knowledge. This paternalistic logic was widely accepted and rarely challenged. Yet the definition of best interest was dangerously flexible. Treatments were often chosen not because they restored identity, but because they maintained order. Isolation reduced disruption. Silence reduced agitation. Routine reduced unpredictability. From an institutional standpoint, these outcomes were desirable. A calm ward was a successful ward. Whether patients recovered their sense of self was secondary, sometimes irrelevant. Some physicians began to express unease in private correspondence and marginal notes. They observed that patients who had arrived distressed but self-aware gradually became placid and detached. This change was interpreted officially as improvement, but informally, it raised doubts. Was the patient healing, or simply withdrawing? Was calmness a sign of recovery, or of resignation? These questions rarely made it into formal reports. To acknowledge them would have required confronting the possibility that treatment itself was causing harm. It would have meant admitting that authority, when unchecked, could damage the mind as surely as disease. The ward's methods existed in a grey zone between care and control. Isolation was framed as protection. Silence was framed as rest. Repetition was framed as therapy. Each intervention could be defended individually. Together, they formed a system that stripped away autonomy while claiming benevolence. Patients who showed distress were often subjected to stricter measures. Solitary confinement, extended observation, and, in some cases, physical restraint were employed under the guise of safety. These measures were not intended as punishment, but they carried punitive effects. Deprived of stimulation and human connection, patients deteriorated further. Their increased withdrawal was then cited as evidence of illness progression. Families who questioned these practices faced barriers. Medical authority was difficult to challenge, especially when cloaked in scientific language. Relatives were told that they did not understand the complexities of the condition. Their emotional reactions were framed as interference. Over time, many families withdrew, exhausted and powerless. The absence of oversight allowed practices to persist unexamined. There were no ethics committees, no patient advocates, no requirement to justify prolonged confinement beyond vague references to necessity. Decisions were made behind closed doors, recorded in technical language that obscured human impact. One of the most troubling aspects was the redefinition of success. Recovery, traditionally understood as a return to one's former self, was quietly replaced by stability. A patient who no longer asked questions, no longer expressed distress, and no longer disrupted routines was considered improved, even if they remained nameless. This shift revealed an implicit priority: control over cure. Doctors rarely considered what it meant to live without identity. They focused on observable behavior rather than internal experience. A patient who could function within the ward structure was deemed acceptable. The cost, loss of self, was invisible to metrics and therefore ignored. Some contemporaries outside the hospital began to raise broader concerns about institutional care. Philosophers and social critics questioned whether confinement itself could damage the mind. They warned that removing individuals from society and subjecting them to rigid systems risked creating the very disorders such institutions claim to treat. These critiques circulated quietly, overshadowed by faith in progress and expertise. Within the ward, the ethical dilemma deepened as patients remained longer than intended. Discharge required identity. Identity required memory. Memory was not returning. The ward thus became a holding space, trapping patients in a limbo of care without outcome. Keeping them confined could be justified as protection. Releasing them could be framed as negligence. Either choice carried moral weight, yet neither resolved the underlying harm. Doctors reassured themselves that they were acting responsibly. They pointed to the absence of alternatives. There were no effective treatments for profound memory loss. The ward, they argued, provided shelter, food, and supervision. Without it, patients would be vulnerable. This argument, though pragmatic, avoided confronting the possibility that vulnerability was being prolonged by the very system meant to address it. The language used in records further distanced practitioners from ethical reckoning. Patients were described in passive terms. The subject exhibits, the case demonstrates. Such phrasing erased agency and emotion. It transformed suffering into abstraction. When people become cases, harm becomes theoretical. The most unsettling ethical breach was not cruelty, but indifference. No one intended to erase identities. No one set out to destroy selves. The harm emerged from routine, from unquestioned authority, from a system that valued order over humanity. This made it harder to recognize and easier to excuse. In modern terms, the ward violated principles that would later define medical ethics: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence. But in 1844, those principles were still unarticulated. The absence of ethical language made harm easier to overlook. Without a framework to name wrongdoing, discomfort remained private and fleeting. The ward existed at a crossroads of history, where medicine was gaining unprecedented power without corresponding responsibility. It demonstrated how easily care can become control when those receiving it cannot speak for themselves. And it exposed a terrifying truth, that forgetting one's name did not only erase identity, it erased protection. By the time questions of ethics began to surface more openly, the ward had already done its work. Patients had passed through it changed in ways that could not be undone. Their silence testified to a system that never asked whether it should stop. What remained was an uneasy legacy, a reminder that the greatest dangers in medicine do not always announce themselves with violence or scandal. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as care, and leave behind people who can no longer tell you who they were. As months turned into years, the ward that had become infamous for erasing identities slowly faded from view, its existence slipping quietly into obscurity. Patients were transferred to other hospitals, discharged under the care of relatives, or simply disappeared from the official records. Those who left often carried with them no sense of who they once were. Their names and histories dissolved into the blank spaces left by the ward's routines. For many, life outside the hospital was a continuation of the emptiness they had experienced inside, a haunting reminder that memory and identity, once fractured, do not always return. The decline of the ward was not abrupt. Administrators quietly repurposed sections of the building, reallocating beds to other departments. New medical theories emerged, and attention shifted toward other neurological and psychiatric phenomena. Reports of patients forgetting themselves became rarer in published accounts, not because the phenomenon had ceased, but because it no longer fit within the emerging frameworks of clinical research. History, in this sense, mirrored the ward itself, selective, incomplete, and indifferent to those it left behind. Families who had once pressed for explanations found their voices fading against the weight of institutional authority. Those who tried to track former patients often discovered gaps in records or sudden transfers to distant facilities. Even for the hospital staff, memory of the ward and its strange outcomes began to blur. The very people who had witnessed the most profound losses of self became part of the institutional forgetting, their recollections marginalized as anecdotal and unscientific. This silence reinforced the unsettling legacy of the ward. The patient's experiences, intensely personal and deeply disturbing, were reduced to footnotes in ledgers and brief mentions in medical journals. Officially, progress had been made. Treatments were refined, wards reorganized, and new theories advanced. Unofficially, the consequences of years spent in a space where names and histories disappeared remained largely unexamined. Those who had been changed by the ward carried the effects into the wider world, their existence marked by absence as much as presence. The ward's disappearance from public consciousness also reflected a broader societal tendency to overlook discomforting truths. Hospitals were trusted institutions, and the notion that a medical facility could inadvertently erase identity was difficult to reconcile with prevailing ideas of care and science. To question the ward was to question the competence of doctors, the efficacy of hospitals, and the very notion of medical progress. And so, the silence endured. Even as the physical space of the ward was transformed, the psychological echoes persisted. Patients who had been released often struggled to navigate ordinary life. Without names, personal histories, or the reinforcement of memory, they moved through the world in a state of quiet disorientation. Their ability to reconnect with family, work, or community was severely compromised. In some cases, attempts at reintegration were abandoned entirely, leaving the ward's invisible legacy to linger in the shadows of everyday existence. Ultimately, the decline and disappearance of the ward did not signify resolution. Its closure, repurposing, or erasure from official documentation merely concealed the depth of what had occurred. The patients' lost identities, the ethical ambiguities, and the quiet complicity of medical authority remained unresolved. The ward, once a site of intense observation and control, became a ghost in the annals of medical history, its lessons unspoken, its victims largely forgotten, and its presence a lingering reminder of the fragile boundary between care and harm.